Welcome to the studio. I'm Kami Nzeram, and I'm delighted to introduce my esteemed panel here who are going to talk to us about something that every CISO needs to know. Post-attack, what are the learnings? Howard, I want to start with you. You've seen a lot in your career. Just take us through some of the things you would like to share, some of the stuff you've seen.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So, look, I've been round the block. One or two people in the audience know me. So I've worked at QB Insurance. I've worked, before that, I was CISO there, and before that so that's in financial services, Deutsche Bank, Vodafone before that. So telco, financial services, Jaguar, Land Rover, very different, very, very different. And all of these companies have different depths of pockets, and that's very relevant for how boards interact and for how much boards know. And they all have different levels of sophistication and team sizes and abilities to do things. One of the things I saw when I was in automobile, and I've got to be careful not to betray too many confidences.
Of course, yeah.
Is one of our suppliers. It was a critical supplier. They got absolutely smashed. It was a very, very simple attack. Very, very briefly, it was the VPN. They had a single password, and most people were using their AD credential that they were sharing. They got caught with people sharing it on Facebook. So it was a simple smash and grab. And they easily got into the domain controllers, encrypted those, took out a company based in 17 locations. They had a very, very small IT department, no cybersecurity staff, and you can imagine that there was chaos. And that's at one end of the spectrum, and you get very sophisticated organizations that have teams that are very on it. They rehearse their playbooks, their board understands. They understand exactly where all the outsourcers are, taking down the network in a very organized way, who's got the keys to the kingdom, keeping the technical people shielded from the interface to the board. Very, very clever. But, they've all got supply chains, and that's often the weak underbelly in a lot of organizations, because the suppliers typically don't have the same wherewithal, funding, deep pockets that the big banks and the others have. And, it varies. And, I think there are some common themes. One is make sure your board at least do a tabletop exercise so they understand in the event of something that could happen, ransomware, we all know what that is, or something quite nasty, what their roles and responsibilities are. Because when stuff happens, when your hair's on fire and people are in panic mode, because that often happens, and that's another theme, trying to calm things down and make sure people just focus on what's important. Stick to the plan. That's it. And stick to the playbooks and keep calm. If the board have no idea, are they going to pay the ransom? They haven't even thought about that. They don't know. You've got the phone ringing all the time because something may get out, because the media now know. You've got different types of stakeholders at the board level who have to do things. It's making sure that they have some understanding of what their roles and responsibilities should something happen. And then it's making sure that you know who the technical people that you absolutely need in the event of an incident, and bridging that interface. And look, this is a feedback loop. After an incident, what happened, lessons learned, what could we do better? That's a feedback loop. So those are the consistent themes. I'm happy to talk about some other experiences, but I'm sure other people on the panel have value to add to this as well.
And Thomas, you're new to this role, but that relationship between the fixer team, so to speak, and the board, that's really, really important, isn't it?
So I think what he said.
And repeat.
No, I've been 15 years at Siemens, German company, really high security.
Yeah.
Very important to protect the know-how. Strong teams, and red team, blue team. I've been at Vestas, which is an engineering wind turbine company. Luckily, as an information security director as well. I left the Vestas 1 year before they got hacked. Luckily for me, but also luckily for the new CISO, because then he got the mandate and the resources that I was, asking for the last 3 years, right?
It must be frustrating when there's stuff you're always asking for and then it happens.
Yeah, But just to resonate some of the learnings, I think it's very easy to look back and see what went wrong, but it's very difficult when you're living it, right? So little pieces of advice that I will give to anyone that is hearing this is, of course, keep the two tracks completely separated. You have your technicians, they are super stressed, they need to fix, they need to understand, they need to solve, and they are techies. They don't want to inform the C-level. And then you have the C-level that they want to know what's going on. So just our role is to bridge those two gaps and inform and get the technical knowledge and transform it into managerial information. I think that's one key learning for us, right? And that other people can use.
And did you? And you obviously you spoke of the incident where you had already left, but were you ever having to deal with it yourself? Were there? I mean, clearly there were. But are there any incidents you can share with us where you?
Yeah, absolutely. We got a zero downtime in our data center when everything, many years ago, when everything was on-prem. And we had thousands of customers because Siemens was also providing services, IT services to many other customers, right? So we had to be there 72 hours non-stop, no sleep, no food. Well, you know how it is, right? And in those cases, the most dangerous thing is that everyone starts running like chicken without head and panicking instead of following the process. And the most important thing is to keep calm and keep the process, and we will get eventually there.
Mm-hmm. David King joining us via Zoom, Legal and General. Keep calm and carry on.
I should just add that I'm a former CISO of Legal and General.
Apologies, sir. Yeah.
A number of years, that's fine. My experience with incidents, obviously, whilst there were a number of things that sort of happen, which are contained. One of my roles, going first, when you're new in as a CISO into an organization such as Legal and General or another organization, one of the things that crosses your mind is, what happens if it goes wrong? And if you don't know what the processes are, then you need to review them and determine what you want to happen as a CISO. And my experience when I arrived was to work with the executive to set up essentially a if you like, crisis team. We didn't go by that name, but a crisis team which can handle and be considered as the team that will handle anything, whether or not it's cyber or not. So one of the things to think about is to integrate, when things get escalated, is to integrate cyber into existing, business continuity operations, or to set them up if they don't actually exist. The key thing here is that, a cyber breach, like it or not, really isn't something that can be handled as part of a normal business operation. It's almost like the definition of it. So if it's going to get escalated to the executive or a crisis committee, then that committee needs to be capable of dealing with this, with all the points that the first gentleman made around things like, muscle memory and practice and tabletop exercises and so on. I also teach this topic at Oxford University and have been doing so for several years. So sort of part of my experience and knowledge is informed by, academic research, but also from the students that I teach, who typically are, mature students who've got experience increasingly these days in cyber, and working that through, which is very, very interesting. Certainly, the learnings from there, I was able to use, and feed straight back into the organization I worked for at the time.
I'm curious about some of the insights that you perhaps get from academia as opposed to the workplace. Are there differences?
What we sort of find is some examples. It's around, a lot of it is around the human piece when it comes to crisis. So things like the enactment principle, which is really about as you participate in a crisis, the decisions you take actually contribute to the crisis, maybe in a positive or a negative way. So it's to recognize that the actions you take and the decisions you take are actually, going to critically affect the outcomes. And to be unaware of that is dangerous. The action I took out of that particular, it was to be the crisis advisor for the group, sitting in on all crisis rehearsals and activities and meetings and so on. as an observer, not as a CISO, and noting down behaviors and evidences of things where there might be groupthink, evidence of enactment principle, and so on. And then there are principles around hindsight and foresight, which are in the literature.
Matt, I mean, I come to you for an overview, given the nature of the work you're in, but actually you've been the other side as well. I just wondered if we could get your perspective.
So yes, I do have perspectives from both sides of the fence. I mean, really great points, hard to really build on, but I think one that we're probably all too familiar with is these never happen at a convenient time.
Never.
It's, it's on a Friday afternoon, or Friday evening going into the weekend. You're not planning on, just being on call, and then all of a sudden Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday have disappeared. A couple of key points that I picked up from around the conversation was crisis simulation. We are, as an industry, pretty good at drilling our technical teams, but it's when it gets outside of the realms of the technical, who do you go to get sign off for a statement when Sky News have come asking, we live in a digital age now. Everything is, as soon as we know it, Twitter knows it or X knows it. It's making sure that not just the board, but it's a business impacting issue. So we need to make sure that the business know they've got roles and responsibilities, and there's two-way streets in that. Keeping the technical teams separated. Part of that is the people challenge. We plan on call, but we're expecting a 15-minute phone call. Someone's put a full day in and then is 24, 72 hours into an incident. You need to plan to be able to alleviate those people, make sure that, you've got backups to your backups. It's often things that we see are overlooked. And then from the academia point, one of the key challenges I've seen is, people rushing to, impress. I guess it's probably a supply chain one as well, but rushing back with answers when they haven't fully investigated it, and then you go off, I call them false starts.
There is that time pressure, isn't there?
There is a time pressure, but you have to know when to just push back and say, I need more time to look into this. And I've seen in many incidents, a supplier typically comes back and is often keen to say, it's this. Everyone goes looking into that, and it turns out to be a dead end, and it's hours of wasted time and resources where, maybe taking another 10 minutes, as little as that, could have, eradicated several, false starts in that situation.
Howard, let's just kind of rewind on the human factor. Recently, MGM, a phishing attack. I mean, so often this comes down to people, and the initial breach is
You're absolutely
human
right.
error.
So one of the attacks I've seen, and again, I won't disclose the organisation, phishing attacks, squirrel waffle, for those of you that are technical, was the way that the payload was actually downloaded. Phishing attacks. So we had outsourcers in a country where lots of outsourcing goes on, had privileged access, sysadmin, logged into their email, clicked on the link for the phishing, and the payload was downloaded. Then Cobalt Strike was used, which was 0 day at the time, so I'm going back 2 years. Then the malware was loaded on one of the desktops, and that spread, that infection spread across the organization. And, regardless of the technical stuff, user awareness and training is so important. There are almost like Janet and John, Rule 101 type things, thou shalt not do. But you'd be amazed, in most organizations, if you launch a campaign, a phishing campaign, you'd be amazed at how many people will click on the link. And you'd be amazed that some people will actually click on a link and then give their credentials. It happens, and there's no substitute for user awareness training, because a lot of the attacks to actually download the payload come in via phishing attacks. It's so important.
Yeah, and I mean, it's something you're nodding, you're like, oh no, you're taking me back. You've lived it. Yeah,
absolutely. So, in fact, Verizon, which is kind of 70% of the network traffic goes through Verizon, they perform annually this report, the DBIR, and 90% of the attacks enters in the organization via phishing. Yeah. That is how important it is that we keep the training and awareness. But of course, for us, is everyday life, right? So we are aware, and when it's so sophisticated, we still fail ourselves, right? So how can we ask our users to be 100% alert when they get hundreds of emails per day and so on, right? So it's very difficult. And there are curves of learning, so we need to be persistent, but not too much, because then we are very repetitive and they ignore the message. Or if we are too distant, they forget that we are teaching that lesson. So it's about consistently on a monthly by monthly basis to send these simulations so they are keeping alert. That's one of the things we've practiced.
And David, I wonder again, this may be something that your academic work has shed some light on. Are there certain groups or classes of employee or colleague that tend to be more susceptible to this kind of risk?
That's a really good question. Just put a bit of context around this. I mean, things like security awareness are really about the prevention rather than the response and reaction to a situation. There's a different sort of, if you like, a segment of the dial. If you're going to do security awareness training, experience is that you'd want to focus the messages according to the different audiences, and part of this is about who are the most risky individuals within a firm, those with elevated access and privileged access, of course. So, specific, frequent training and measuring of training as well is key. There needs to be a general level of understanding right across an organization's population that has, access to technology, IT, of course, with the phishing training. There may be cases where people in an organization, don't have access to computers and stuff. In which case, then a different approach needs to be taken. I've come across that as well, where people are perhaps working in a factory, hands-on. So then the question is sort of what sort of awareness needs to be done there, and it's sort of very specific. So, a lot of this stuff is around sort of detail and in the weeds. Repeated training's important, but also people do get used to repetition in training messages. So keeping it fresh is important. Keeping new ideas and bringing in new ideas is key as well. But as I say, it's more about the prevention before it happens and the response. The human side of the response is absolutely critical, of course, and what happens when it has actually gone wrong. It's really and as the gentleman said earlier about the technology, you've got the technologists who are busy beavering away trying to get to the to what's really going on, putting your arms around the whole thing and making sure that we don't make any presumptions and commitments, if you like. But the real issue around crisis management is the human piece. It's how people respond. It's creating that muscle memory so that when stuff goes wrong, people know what to do. They know because they've done it in rehearsal. So, they know the relationships, they know the roles and responsibilities, they know why they're there. And I should also add on the subject of playbooks. Playbooks aren't enough. You've got to be able to, have the A team at the crisis level who's capable of doing whatever's necessary. And taking whatever decisions, because it's never really going to work out like you thought it was. That's the problem with crises. It never follows the playbook. So they have a role, but they've got to be contextualized within the overall management of a crisis.
So we're going to come to questions in a moment, but I just wanted to get one further reflection from you, Matt. Less on the response, more on the preparation. I mean, people don't want to do more training courses, do they? Come and do this online cyber. How do you keep it fresh? How do you keep it interesting?
I think crisis simulations are a great way to do that, but expanding
because they can actually be fun.
They can be fun, but it can also give people,
fun, so to speak.
Well, no, they are. There's varying levels of them. I mean, there's detailed technical work-throughs at a very sort of granular level. You can take them up degrees depending on who you're tailoring that to. But it's more about it gives people an understanding of what the impact is of what I guess is the butterfly effect, how one small action can create a ripple throughout the organisation. I think phishing is a really key point because it's something that we've moved beyond the very poorly spelt attacks that we had several years ago to now.
I'm a rich prince and I wish to.
Yeah, exactly. And now we've got we've got phishing, vishing, spear phishing. They're looking into LinkedIn. Who are the execs? They're looking at the results. It's really targeted. They know they need to invest the time and effort because the output is worth it. And what we see is, you know, Outlook or whatever email provider you have has a phishing button for you to click to instantly alert that you think that's an attack or a potential one. But what we found when we actually go and work with organisations and we look in the sort of the aftermath is for an individual to actually find out how to report an incident, it's not as easy. You know, often outside of the IT team or the security team, actually knowing where to go to make it known as quickly as possible in that critical few minutes that something's happened can be quite challenging. You know, often they're hidden. You know, you almost need a button on the desktop that you can just hit and it calls in the A team and you know, you can get started. So, you know, there's some really important points that sometimes it's the simple things are the most effective in the organisation, and you know, the training is one part of it, but you know, we need that external view, and that's where, you know, bringing in external companies can help, because it's that independent perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I wanted to reply that before to David, because I think that is correct. We are focusing now a little bit on the prevention, not on the after incident, right? But I think it's good that the trust culture that he's mentioning, so if an employee does something wrong, or accidentally, of course, he or she can immediately recognize that something is wrong, and that's what I like to call the human intelligence versus the artificial intelligence, because on technology we have, you know, AI, firewalls, detection, IPS, IDS, whatever. But then it's important that our humans, the ones that are every day processing finance invoices, every day processing HR data, that they detect when things are starting to look odd, and that they react, and that they can openly say, hey, IT, something is wrong with my computer, please check. I think I paid accidentally wrong $2 million to this company because they fooled me to pay this invoice. Check. You know, it's important. I think it's a really good point.
It's that immediate aftermath of the breach. You know, I think we consider the breach as probably 10, 15, maybe even further after it, and it's a really important point of that, it's that immediate point, because it could save so much for organisations.
Those initial minutes, hours are priceless. You know, you can imagine the Friday night syndrome. You know, unfortunately, attackers, they don't work UK 9 to 5 business hours. It doesn't work like that. I wish they did, but they don't. And that initial time is so ultra important. You're absolutely right. It's all very well having the training, but people have got to know who they can contact if they smell or suspect that something is wrong. Being able to pick up the bat phone or send an email or do something, those initial minutes are priceless.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's obviously some very well publicised accounts of you know, sophisticated financial fraud, where actually it's targeted over multiple jurisdictions to coincide with bank holidays and extended periods of where oversight is not as keen as it would be in normal hours. By the way, I'm loving. We've had Bat Phone, we've had A-Team. I'm just wondering who's going to be B.A. Baracus and Howling Mad Murdoch. But perhaps I'm revealing my age somewhere there. Questions from our audience? Yes, sir.
Sure.
What's your name? What do you do?
Alex Kamara, work at GSK, Cyber Risk Director there. My question is really about your experiences and what maybe your strategies that you might have. And we're talking about post-incident, right? So if you've suffered a breach of some sort, that breach has impacted one of your critical third parties, one of your suppliers. What's your position after that? Like, do you consider that third party now as someone you would just discard, or would you consider continuing working with them? What would you do after that?
I can reply. I have a couple of examples of suppliers that they could have compromises. One was a data center supplier, so all the data center went down again. So working for long journeys all the weekend, but luckily it didn't have really much business impact, right? So at the end it was an agreement on, you know, a penalty to the supplier. The second case was even much funnier, I would say. It's what I call cybersecurity by obsolescence. So everyone was being hacked by the supplier. except us, because we were so behind in the upgrades that we didn't get the virus ourselves, right? But in that case, of course, we couldn't argue anything. We were not hit, but the negotiations, they got stronger on the next year.
Really good question. So look, I've got two rules when this happens. When we get notified by a supplier, because they do let us know, because it's in their interest to do so, they either want help or they know that it's important. There are two things that I do immediately is pull up the drawbridge, because the one thing as a CISO or anybody in the cybersecurity team that you don't want is the proliferation of the malware, ransomware, whatever the strain happens to be, in your own network. You don't want that, because depending on the organization you work in, there's a myriad of ways in which suppliers connect to the organization. It could be direct connectivity via holes in the firewall, some sort. It could be a lease line. It could be the VPN. It could be portals where they have to authenticate and actually, log in and do things. It doesn't matter. But pulling up the drawbridge, disabling all the accounts, making sure that no further access into the said organization that you represent is possible. That's the first thing. And I do that every single time. And the second thing is I won't actually pull down the drawbridge until I'm satisfied I know exactly what the ransomware strain or whatever the malware strain is, checked with our EDR and all the different tools, that we don't have any occurrence of that in our own network, because that's the whole point here. Also, that someone very senior in the organization on their own letter-headed paper or an email with their signature has stated that they are now clean. They called in the cavalry, the IR team typically, and they've actually managed the breach. Because the last thing that you want is any proliferation in your own network.
David, wise words?
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. I would also add that if you've got a supply chain breach, if it's upstream, things like, have they got your data? Are they processing your data on your behalf? And if so, and it's a cyber breach, you've been notified, then, understanding the extent to which and the amount of data you've got and the risk associated with it being, breached and put on the dark web, for example, needs to be understood. And then the other question is around really operational resilience. And if you've got a supplier who's no longer, because you've done the actions that the gentleman's just described, but that presumably is going to impact the business, because the business is using that supplier to do something useful. So what will you do? Will you, as you say, will you go back to the supplier, or have you got alternative mechanisms, and can you switch to another supplier? So those sorts of things are part of the longer term thinking strategically about, how you manage critical suppliers and what you do if something bad were to happen to a supplier, such as, a cyber breach, or if the supplier, for example, were to, hit the, go bust, for example. So those sort of things need to be considered too. There's a broad piece around putting your arms around that supplier and understanding the total risk, and then understanding what you do as an organization to make sure you build operational resilience, so that you're protected against the supplier going down and going out.
Now, just to add on that and what you say and resonate, I think it's super crucial to improve the partnership and the connection with the supplier, that they inform you, that you are not contacted by your CEO telling you, hey, Thomas, have you heard about this being hacked? Are we safe? That's crucial, right? That's how business should work. And sometimes, unfortunately, we found out that somebody has been hacked through external colleagues, external vendors, and so on.
Yeah, and you've seen that happen.
Yeah, and I think it's situational. To your point, you have to understand what the breach was, why it occurred. Was it they just don't have the right controls in place, and then that's a different type of conversation. Was it they had everything in place and it was an unfortunate event? And you have to look at each one in its individuality and then assess against your own risk profile. You have to take in the business criticality, what they do to you. Is it an inherently risky business that they're operating on your behalf? So there's many layers to that, but I think it's the transparency with the supplier and making sure they're driving that information to you. I think any supplier that hides behind this is a black box service, you don't need to know that. Those are the sort of red flags that I've seen in these types of situations. But if they're open, honest, transparent, then ultimately, I guess it comes down to a risk-based decision of, how they impact your business.
Just to follow on from that, sorry to interrupt, but I just listening to your point and David's point earlier, being on the front foot is so important. This is where I think threat intelligence is very, very, very worthwhile. Lots of people think that they can get information from you from the dark web and make it valuable. Lots of companies claim that the threat intelligence partners, the tips, they all say they can do this. The ones that really can do it are very useful, because in the event that there has been a supplier breach, typically they may have some of your data. This is business. Knowing that you can rely on a threat intelligence partner who can actually tell you that the chatter and the forums on the dark web, they're trading your data or something like that, being on the front foot so you can react to it is so, so important.
And staying on the front foot, I think, is quite possibly the best concluding thought we could arrive at. We are sadly out of time. Sadly, this is a topic that is not going away. But if we could give a round of applause for our brilliant panel. Howard, Thomas, Matt and David. I'm Kami and Zeram. This is The Studio.